So my talk today is about the self, and by that I mean the subject of experience, of thinking, of desire, of volition, of emotion, of intent, of whimsy, of all sorts of things. In fact, pretty much anything you can be the subject of, that's what I'm talking about, the self in that sense. And the overarching structure for the talk is quite simple. In the first half, I want to get you very confused about how we think about the self. I'm going to get you in a hopeless tangle where you think, oh, this is all very profound and very deep, oh, very interesting. And then I will spend the remainder of the talk explaining why it's not very interesting, slowly unraveling everything, and it'll be a big anticlimax, because that's kind of my method to doing philosophy. The two halves of the talk correspond roughly to the two sides of your handout. So no turning over yet. You have to keep the mystery. If you turn to the other side, you'll get the spoilers. Before I get started on my talk, though, I just want to say a little bit about my choice of subject and why I've chosen to speak about the self. Because this is a lecture series on metaphysics that I've been asked to take part in. And if you look at the other titles in this series, I don't think anyone else is doing any very similar talk. So I just want to comment on this. There was a time in the history of metaphysics when I wouldn't have needed to say anything about why I want to talk about the subject of everything. It would have gone without saying that that was the central focal point of most of what was going on. If you look at the history of metaphysics from Descartes through to Hegel, pretty much the big central thing is, what is the subject, the thinking subject, the experiencing subject? What's going on with that? If we sort that out, then we sort out its relations to the world around it, then we'll have sorted everything out. Obviously, that's a pretty hopelessly grand ambition to have, but you can see why you'd want to be focusing on the subject of experience. And then a funny thing happened in the first half of the 20th century, at least in the tradition that I'm learned in, I suppose, which is broadly English-speaking philosophy that has an interest in science and mathematics. The self kind of went off stage. It almost literally disappears from the way in which philosophy is done. And that's the first reason for my slightly punny title, I Disappear. It's that the self gets removed from the centre stage. There are lots of reasons why that happens. But by and large, an awful lot of philosophers start to think, we're interested in the world as a whole. The experiencing subject is just one particular kind of entity in the world. And you might want to study that, and if you do, that's fine. That's a particular branch of philosophical inquiry, the metaphysics of persons. But you might choose to study other objects instead, very small objects if you're into the philosophy of science, or very big objects if you're also into the philosophy of science, or abstract objects if you're into the philosophy of maths, or whatever. There's all sorts of objects, go and study all of them, whichever ones you want. That's one reason why the self stops having the centre stage. But I'm more interested in another, slightly weirder reason as to why the self stops having the centre stage, and that's that there's a train of philosophical thought in the first half of the 20th century, which tries to say the self is not just one object among others. The self isn't even an object at all. The self couldn't fit into the world. There is no self. And so this school of thought sort of pushes the self entirely out of the world. And that's associated basically with some things that Wittgenstein says, but also a few other philosophers, I think notably Carnap. I'm not going to talk too much about the history of all of this, but I'm totally happy to in the question period. But I am going to focus on some things that Wittgenstein said and then try to tease out some lessons for us about how to think about the self and how not to think about the self. And in particular, I'm going to try and lead you down this path of thinking that maybe the self has to disappear, and that's obviously a bit crazy to think, and you'd have to be, dangerously, unpleasantly mentally unwell to think that. And so then I'm going to explain why you don't have to think it. That's the structure for the talk. Okay, so without further ado, I need to get you tangled up in knots. So I need to introduce a way of thinking about the self which is sufficiently almost normal that you go along with it for a bit until you realize that things have gone badly wrong. And the way of thinking about the self that I want to introduce to you, it has a phrase that philosophers use. It's called immunity to error through misidentification. That is a 15-syllable phrase. It is cumbersome. It is unfortunate how many times I'm going to have to say the phrase immunity to error through misidentification. But it does actually fit the bill quite well. So what I need to do is explain to you what immunity to error through misidentification is, and then explain why it gives us certain ways of thinking about the self. Okay, so in order to get you thinking about immunity to error through misidentification, I want you to imagine the following scenario, which I shall narrate in the first person, partly for dramatic effect, and partly because I do want us thinking about first-person thought. Okay, so imagine there's a bus accident, and I black out. I come round, and my very first thought is, I hurt. And then I open my eyes, and I look around me, and it's carnage. There's just chaos everywhere, tangles of limbs, blood. It's awful. I look down, and groggily I think, seeing a broken arm, oh, that arm's badly broken. I mean really badly broken. There's no possibility of mistake here. There's like bones sticking through the flesh, that level of stuff. I go, oh, that's really badly broken. And then I realize that the pain that I have is a sort of arm kind of a pain. And then I think, oh, that's my arm. My arm is broken. God, I need help. Okay, so stepping back from the first-person narrative, yeah, it's a totally reasonable thought process that I've gone through. I've had a pain, I've seen some visual stuff, I'm like, oh yeah, that's my broken arm. Reasonable, but it's not a watertight inference. For here's how the story might continue back into first-person narration mode. We start to extricate a tangle of limbs from each other. I pull myself back and miraculously I'm unscathed. The arm belonged to someone else. My arm is not broken at all. It's great for me, sucks for the other guy. What has happened here? Well, I've made a mistake. I was mistaken in thinking my arm was broken. But I didn't just make any mistake, I made an error of misidentification. I thought that was my body that was lying battered and bruised there, and it was someone else's. This is an error of misidentification. That's a pretty grisly example. Let me give you another example just to kind of set the mood and also, just trying to lighten it in a way. So imagine, I really like baking. You don't need to imagine, this is actually true. I really do like baking. So imagine that I'm there baking away and I turn away from my workbench and I walk past a mirror frame and I look into it and I see what I take to be my reflection and I think, oh gosh, I've got a blob of buttercream icing on my forehead. I should clean up this buttercream icing from my forehead. Again, a reasonable thing to think. But unbeknownst to me, that's not my reflection. There's a cunningly trained actor disguised as me, mirroring my every move behind a pane of glass, with one crucial difference. He has a blob of buttercream icing on his head, and I don't. Again, it's an error of misidentification. I thought that forehead is my forehead, but it wasn't. It was someone else's. Okay, all of these are kind of crazy cases. They don't happen. Or if they do happen, they happen very, very rarely. I'm not trying to get you to entertain skeptical worries where you go, gosh, maybe I'm in a sort of Truman Show setup where all of the reflections are not reflections, they're just actors. That's not what I want you to go down. I just want you to recognize that the thought here is intelligible. To say, it's not my arm that was broken after all, or it's not my forehead that had the buttercream icing on it after all. It looks like in all of these cases there is a possibility of error by misidentification. Now, if you're a philosopher and you encounter a phenomenon like this for the first time, you're going to want to apply pressure on it. And the natural way to apply pressure is to ask, are all cases of first-person thought susceptible to the same kind of error? Or are there certain kinds of first-person thought where you couldn't make that kind of mistake? It looks like any time I try to offer a physical description, I can end up making a similar mistake. Just come up with a complicated array of mirrors and trickery, and in the end you'll be able to get a similar kind of situation where it turns out I have made an error of misidentification. But are there any other kinds of thoughts? Well, Wittgenstein, who's the guy who first really starts discussing this, says yes. Let's go back to that bus accident scenario. My very first thought was, I hurt, before I'd opened my eyes or anything like that. Could I have been mistaken about who was hurt? Now that seems like a much weirder thing to be mistaken about. In the case where I think that I've broken my arm, I can stand back and I can say, wait, is it definitely me who has a broken arm and not someone else? And it's an intelligible question precisely because I've given you a story where it turns out that it wasn't me that had a broken arm and it was someone else. It's a weird question in most circumstances, but it's intelligible. But if I say, I hurt, can I then stand back and intelligibly say, is it certainly me that hurts and not someone else? I'm going to pause just to allow that to sink in, because there is something very weird about asking that question. Now, later I'm going to say, yeah, actually you can totally reasonably think that thought. But that's a very niche view that I'm going to be pushing for. So for now, I'm just going to go with what Wittgenstein and almost everyone else writing about this says. They say, no, it's crazy to ask, is it me who hurts? Of course, there's no possibility of error there by misidentification. And so we get this idea from Wittgenstein, this is on your handout, that there are two different ways of using the word I. There's the use as subject, as he calls it, and that's to govern things like I hurt, where I can't be mistaken about who the subject is. And it doesn't just work with hurt, it also works supposedly with things like thinking. Suppose I think to myself, the moon is made of green cheese. I can stop and I can ask, is that right? I can stop and I can ask, will anyone believe me? But can I stop and ask, is it me that's having the thought and not someone else? Supposedly not. And Wittgenstein lists a whole bunch of cases, but if you just go back to the very first thing I said at the start of the talk, I said I'm interested in the self as the subject of experience, of thinking, of volition, of desire, of emotion. In all of those cases, it looks like I can't be mistaken about who the subject is. So that's the use as subject. And then there's the use as object. These are the cases where there is a possibility of error by misidentification. The case where, for example, I think my arm is broken, but I realize it's someone else's arm. The case where I think I have buttercream icing on my forehead, but in fact it's on someone else's forehead, and so on. And Wittgenstein suggests that in cases which involve the recognition of a particular person, there is the possibility of an error, or as I should rather put it, the possibility of an error has been provided for. And that's governing all those cases of the use as object. Okay, so that's the phenomenon. That there's these two different ways of using the word I, as subject and as object, as Wittgenstein puts it. It's not quite the grammatical category of subject and object, but it's meant to be tracking this notion of immunity to error through misidentification and cases where you can make a mistake. So far, apparently all I've been doing is drawing attention to a certain phenomenon about the way that you all speak, even if you weren't aware of it exactly until now. But now I want to tell you why it leads to some quite scary, odd-looking thoughts. So that's two ways in which it does that. The first is it leads to a certain kind of privacy, and the second is it leads to a certain kind of disappearing, vanishing self thing. So I'm going to go through these two worrying ideas in turn. Let's start with the privacy. Focusing on the case where I say, I hurt, it's clear that I can convey an awful lot by using those words. For example, suppose I say, I hurt, and you say, oh, I'm terribly sorry, is there anything I can do to help? Perhaps you would like a medicinal quantity of whiskey. I say, oh, thank you, that's very tasty. Oh, yes, that's nice. It would be an apt response in certain circumstances. Alternatively, I might say, I hurt, and you know that the reason for the hurt is that I have overindulged in non-medicinal quantities of whiskey the night before, and I have brought the pain upon myself, in which case you might appropriately, gently mock me for the pain I am suffering. There are indeed many different appropriate responses to professions of human suffering, but I'm not going to try and list them all because that would be a talk in ethics, and I have nothing really to contribute there. All I really want to get across is that phrases like this, phrases about the first personal use as subject, are things that we do trade in and we can make sense of in public discourse. We put them out there and people respond, and that's all well and good. But now I want you to ask, can you understand absolutely everything that I mean when I say, I hurt? And I really mean absolutely everything that I mean when I say, I hurt. Here's an argument that you can't. So when I said, I hurt, there was this immunity to error through misidentification. I can't doubt who the subject of the pain is. When you try to report what I've said to someone else, you say the best you can do is, he hurts, because you're not me, so you can't use the word I to do it. But when you say, he hurts, the possibility for error by misidentification has crept back in. You can stop and sensibly check, is it certainly him that hurts and not someone else? Might I have just misidentified where the voice was coming from? Or perhaps we're in a situation where there's a skilled ventriloquist throwing their voice and making it seem like he is hurting when in fact someone else, totally unrelated, is hurting. You can just about intelligibly ask these questions. The possibility of misidentification has crept back in. So when the thought left my lips, as it were, there was no possibility of error, and now on your lips there is this possibility of error. And depending on exactly how you think about thoughts, you might think, this has undergone a change. You're not thinking the same thought because a new kind of possibility has opened up. That seems pretty bad, if you ask me, because it suggests that whenever I make one of these uses of the I as subject, I express something which you can't possibly think. And that's weird for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons it's weird is that the point of saying things out loud is to try to make things such that you think what I think. It is to share thoughts. Language is a vehicle for public communication, and it would be kind of scary in various ways if any time I used the I as subject, I wasn't able to communicate really what I wanted to do. That's a very kind of spooky place to be in. And just to anticipate a little bit for those of you who are trained philosophers who sort of know Kung Fu, as it were, this is sort of going off down lines that Wittgenstein will develop later, to say, if you really bought into it, then any use of the I as subject would be like a private language. But there are no private languages. Languages are inherently public. So something's gone weird already. But it gets weirder and it gets worse if you think of this immunity to error through misidentification as associated with a particular use of the word I, the I as subject. So let's just think a bit and say, is there any way that I can unpack what I mean when I say I in I hurt? Suppose I was to try to offer you another phrase to explain who the I was there. So I might say something like, well, I am the man who's approximately 5'11", standing behind the wooden lectern in 14 Gordon Square at about whatever time it is, I don't know, 6, something like that. Obviously, again, it's a physical description, so the possibility of error by misidentification has come in. Maybe some elaborate contraption of mirrors. Actually, this isn't building number 14, it's building number 16. People have rearranged things, etc., etc., etc. I ended up picking out the wrong person with the description, but I couldn't have picked out the wrong person when I said, I hurt, or I'm thinking certain thoughts. Well, how else might I try to explain what the I is when I say, I hurt? I might say, I'm Tim. Guys, I'm Tim. You know who I am? Tim. Just in case you don't know who I am, it's Tim. That will be helpful to the example. I'm not just coming up with some other name. Okay, but even there, apparently, there is the possibility of error by misidentification. This is a little bit of a weird case, and I will come back to it. But imagine the bus accident again. So I think, I hurt. Maybe I even say it out loud and say, I hurt, guys, I need help. And one of the paramedics around knows me and says, oh, Tim hurts, to one of his colleagues. And I think, yeah, I hurt, and I bet I hurt more than this Tim guy, and I really hope the paramedics deal with me before Tim. And the reason I'm capable of thinking that thought is because I've sustained a severe head injury and I've forgotten that I'm Tim. Okay? Again, unlikely, but it could happen. So there's a possibility of error by misidentification if I try to substitute a name in for the first person, because the name is, again, picking out an object kind of a use. The name is what you guys use to talk about me, and you always have the possibility of error about who you're talking about. But I have to talk about me with the first person if I want to have this immunity to error through misidentification. Pretty quickly, you'll get to this thought, there's nothing you can say to explain what the I there is doing, except trivialities like I am me, which is not really going to help anything. So what happens next? We've got this use of I, which just seems deeply unexplainable now. And in that situation, maybe the best thing to do is just try to ditch it from our language. We can't substitute in a particular subject who we're trying to talk about without some kind of loss, without a possibility of error creeping in. So maybe instead of saying, I hurt, I should just moan, right? I mean, that would achieve the same kind of effect. But if I moaned, you wouldn't be mistaken into thinking that I was somehow trying to talk about a particular entity. It wouldn't have the grammatical form of such and such de-dum-de-dums. It would just be, And there's no structure to that, so you wouldn't think I was trying to use a naming phrase like perhaps I or Tim. And that's something that Wittgenstein himself suggests. There's no difference between saying I hurt and moaning, except that in the one case you're misled into thinking that there's a subject floating around to be picked out, and in the other case you're not misled because there's just a moan. Moaning is a good solution for dealing with I hurt, but it's a little bit harder if you want to say things like I think that the moon is made of green cheese. I mean, you could just ditch the I think, but you might think there's something slightly lost there. The easiest way to get around it is to employ a grammatical device which we use all the time to talk about the weather. So you say, it rains. You don't mean that there's some particular thing which is now doing a raining thing. You just mean rain. You know, we just grammatically say, it rains. But we don't think that the it is picking out any particular entity. We should do the same here. Instead of saying, I think, we should say, it thinks. Instead of saying, I hurt, we should say, it hurts. Actually, we do say that, but don't think that that's elliptical for it hurts me. There's no me left in this language anymore. You just say, it hurts. Hurts. Sort of floating over the whole like rain. The best thing I can do at this point is say something in German, and I'll explain why in a second. So it's on your handout. It's es denkt, sollte man sagen, so wie man sagt, es blitzt, which is an aphorism from Lichtenberg, which roughly translates to, it thinks, you should say, just as you say, it rains. So that's the idea, that you eliminate this way of talking about first-person stuff. You just try and eliminate it with this grammatical form. And I say that roughly translates to that, because actually the German phrase es blitzt doesn't mean it rains. It means it lightnings, but you can't say it lightnings in English, so you have to translate it as it rains. But it's so much better if you think of it as it lightnings, because then you have this image that rather than saying I think, you just think that thought sort of crackles overhead like lightning disembodied. Which is kind of cool, but also completely bonkers. I mean, you'd have to be in a very painful place to actually start buying into any of this. Unfortunately, though, it's something that there is a tendency pushing us towards. It's not just all the difficulties that I've been talking about, it gets worse still. So Wittgenstein not only suggests that we drop this use of the first person, replacing I hurt with just moaning or it hurts. If you've got rid of the word I as meaning to pick out the self as subject, why not just get rid of the subject altogether? If there's no way you can pick it out, how could you possibly think there is such a thing? And Wittgenstein not only pursues that, but he offers a further kind of example, a further kind of argument saying why you should do that. So he's thinking about the I see stuff rather than I hurt. And he's saying you might offer several reports of what you see. I see a lectern, I see a table, I see a glass, I see the doors. And he asks, what is it I want all of these cases of seeing to have in common? The obvious answer should be that I am the one doing the seeing. But how do I pick out what that object in common is? And Wittgenstein starts running through answers and saying none of them's adequate. So he says, as an answer, I have to confess to myself it's not my bodily appearance. I don't always see part of my body when I see. And it isn't essential that my body, if seen amongst the things I see, should always look the same. In fact, I don't mind how much it changes. And I feel the same way about all the properties of my body, the characteristics, my behavior, even about my memories. The structure of the argument here is a little bit opaque, but the general idea is something like this. In all of these cases, if I tried to pick out any one of these other things and said, is that me? First, there would be the possibility of an error by misidentification. And second, I think Wittgenstein thinks there is actual error. we just go through a thought experiment and we say, suppose that my visual experience changed. I'd still want to say that I see. Suppose I stopped seeing a particular part of my body. There we go. It's still me that's doing the seeing. Suppose I didn't have the certain memories associated with the previous seeing. Well, it would still be me that was doing the seeing. But there's no entity left for me to pick out. There's just the theatre of seeing itself. But that's not an object in the world at all. And so it disappears. Okay, that's bad. That's very bad news. So that's the kind of puzzling situation that we're meant to find ourselves in. I should just say, for something like the historical record, I don't think Wittgenstein himself kind of buys into all of the things that I've been saying. In fact, I think he offers us this line of thought partly because he's playing with it, partly because he's intrigued by it. Partly these are just lecture notes. He's definitely bouncing around the ideas. They're not in a settled form. He's attracted by it, he's repulsed by it, but in the end I think he's trying to throw it out to us to think through and then say why it's wrong. So I now want to say why it's wrong, and I'm not particularly going to lean upon Wittgenstein in explaining why it's wrong. I'm just going to try and give you my own reason for thinking that it's wrong. You've had quite a lot thrown at you, so I feel like now is just another moment to just pause and say something nice about Lichtenberg, because he's a real unsung hero in all of this. Lichtenberg is one of the earliest advocates of A4 paper. Dating back to the mid-18th century, he writes to a friend and says, wouldn't it be awesome if paper was such that if you folded it in half, that preserved the ratio? And in fact, I found that paper is made with this ratio just nearby. And A4 paper was born. That's nice. Much better than US letter paper. Unfortunately, he writes that letter in 1786, which is a bit after America has declared independence. So I suspect that's why they have the wrong paper. Anyway, okay, so now you can turn over the handout and we can get to the side where I start to explain why everything sort of went wrong, how it was that we ended up going wrong. There's several places you might want to jump off the bus. You might think that everything was going fine all the way up until the bit where I said, I disappear. It was going fine when you were saying, just moan instead of saying, I hurt, and just say, it thinks instead of saying, I think. That stuff was all okay. The bad bit was when you started ditching the self from the world altogether. I have a little bit of sympathy with that. I would say, though, that Wittgenstein's not committing a crude philosophical error there. There's a lot of people who look at the metaphysics of persons today. So they look at the specialist bit of metaphysics, which looks at persons, and they ask, well, what is it for you to persist across time? And they ask questions exactly like the ones that Wittgenstein's just run through. You know, what kind of modification can you tolerate in order that you remain the same person over time? And you might run through various bits exactly as he's done and say, well, I don't care about my bodily appearance and I don't care about any particular memories. You might say what matters is that my brain perseveres. But here's a wacky thought experiment. Imagine that tiny little nanobots have been creeping into your bed at night, every night for the past 15 years, and slowly replacing the biological stuff that makes up your brain with little bits of silicon, which perform functionally exactly the same role. And gradually over time, you've been replaced by a cyborg brain. If you think that what matters to personal identity is the brain, then that killed you. But you didn't notice, so probably you didn't actually die. That's the kind of thing that gets traded around in the metaphysics of personal identity. At various stages, people just bite the bullet and say, yeah, no, it's brains, and that process would kill you. Can't tell you exactly when, but that's a way of dying. Similarly, with the stuff about Wittgenstein saying, I don't care about how many of my memories are preserved, some people just say, no, if you lose all your memories, that's the end of you, that's it. And then you say, really, but what about when you go to sleep? You go, doesn't matter, something else. The point is, it's actually quite hard to attack that stage of things. What I want to do is attack this whole thing about immunity to error through misidentification. Basically, you can pitch the account I want to give in one of two ways. You can either say, I think that phenomenon never happens, or you can say, I think that phenomenon happens all the time, but either way it's boring. So I don't really mind which way you pitch it. You'll see why I'm sort of hesitant about how to characterize my view. But basically, what I really want to do is convince you that it's boring and it shouldn't lead you down into these scary ways of thinking about the self. So what I first want to do is get you thinking about ways in which you might be mistaken in saying, I hurt. Right? So that was my paradigm instance of this phenomenon. I just want you to think, how can you be mistaken in making that kind of a claim? Well, here's a very easy way in which you might be mistaken. Suppose, well, I'll probably remember what I wanted to say. Suppose you say, I hurt, and I look at you and say, really? You look really very happy, actually. And you go, oh, yeah, I didn't mean I hurt. I meant I'm perfectly fine. What a strange slip of the tongue. It's a weird slip of the tongue, I admit, but it's no weirder than that stuff about buttercream icing. So I'm kind of playing the game in a legitimate way, I think. Or if you want cases which are more relevant in some sense, consider the phenomenon of aphasia. So some people have periods of their life when they really struggle with word finding. And such people will end up making misreports of certain kinds of attributions to themselves. They might say, I, and then struggle to get the right word out, and end up saying hurt, when instead they meant to say something rather different. In those cases, they can have made mistakes. That's perfectly legitimate. Now, if you say that that's too cheap a way of making a mistake, then I'll point you back to the fact that earlier, my opponent, as it were, was saying, when I say I hurt, I don't mean the same as Tim hurts, because I might have had a life-changing brain injury that makes me forget that I'm Tim. And I'm drawing attention to the fact that, real-life people have aphasia and do struggle with word finding in certain circumstances. So I am playing the game as it's being played correctly. Okay, so that shows that you can be mistaken in saying, I hurt. You might think, though, that that's not very interesting. And the reason it's not very interesting is partly because it looks kind of cheap, but partly because what we were trying to do was find a phenomenon of immunity to error through misidentification. And you might say, all right, when you were mistaken in saying, I hurt, there wasn't a misidentification there. What went wrong is you mislabeled your experience. You labeled it as a hurty, painy kind of experience when you should have labeled it as a different kind of experience. But you didn't get confused as to who had the experience. There was no doubt in your mind as to who experienced it. That's all well and good. There's no possibility of error of identification of the subject. And that's what we're actually interested in. I think that's basically right, but I think thinking that through is going to make us see that this is actually a very boring phenomenon. So one of the things I slightly like about philosophy is I get to come up with increasingly ridiculous thought experiments. So I now want you to imagine a case where I make this aphasic kind of utterance, but there's also someone else in the room alongside me and you who is in agonizing pain. Okay, so here's the situation. I say, I hurt. And that's a mistake because I'm not in pain. I'm actually perfectly well. I've just had a slip of the tongue or found the wrong word. But someone else in the room is in agonizing pain. And you, who are aware that I sometimes make these mistakes, say, you don't hurt, he does. That's what agonizing pain looks like. You meant to say, I'm having a lovely time. Or something like that. And I go, yeah, you are right, that is what I meant to say. But my mistake was not that I thought I was him, that I thought I was the guy who was in pain. Maybe when I said I hurt, I didn't even know there was another person in the room with me. It wasn't an error of misidentification. I was saying something about me, there's no doubt about that, but I said something false. That, I think, is the correct analysis of the situation. There's no error of misidentification. Okay, but that kind of response is actually something that you get in any use of the first person. That's something you get with broken arms as well. Because if I say, I have a broken arm, and then you point out that I don't, and I say, oh, yeah, so I don't. What a curious thing to say. Still, I didn't mistake myself for someone who had a broken arm. I just said something false about me. There wasn't a mistake of identification. There was no doubt who I was talking about. I was talking about me. And you know how I know I was talking about me? Because I used the word I, and that's kind of how it works. This is no longer a very interesting kind of a claim to be making, but my claim is this. There is a possibility of an error through misidentification if, and only if, I pick out myself using something other than a first-person indexical. That shouldn't come as any surprise at all. But what I mean by that is something like the following. If I say a phrase of the form, I de-dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-dum, that might be true and it might be false, but it's going to be making a claim about me, and that's how you assess whether it's true or false. It doesn't matter whether you say, I hurt, plugged in there, or whether you plug in, I have a broken arm, or you say, I am 33 years old, or I am speaking right now. There's no interestingly different things to plug in there. You're always just talking about you. That's all that's happening here. On the other hand, if you say X de-dum-de-dum-de-dums, X hurts, X is 33, X has a broken arm, and the X there doesn't involve the first-person phrase, well, then there's an open question as to whether I'm talking about me or not. It's as simple as that. That's all the phenomenon was getting at. Just to bring out how profoundly uninteresting this is, I'm going to run through a series of similar cases which are plainly not very exciting. So, I've been talking about first-person stuff. I've been talking about picking out me. And you do that typically with indexicals, like I or me. If you have an inflected language, maybe you speak German, you do it with ich, mich, and mir. If you speak Spanish, you can do it with verb endings instead. But there's the general point that there are certain kinds of first-person indexical indicators in our language. But there's plenty of other indexical indicators as well. There are spatial indexicals, like here versus there. There are temporal indexicals, like now versus then, and things like that. You get exactly the same kind of phenomenon using here as you do with I. So here's a question for you. If I say, here is London, I can, presumably pause and think, is that right? Is it definitely here that's London and not somewhere else? Might I have been sort of whipped away during the talk? We have been just carried to an entirely different city? I can intelligibly stop and ask that kind of a question. If I say, here is blah-de-blah-de-blah-de-blah, and I fill in that with any kind of name or description that doesn't itself involve an indexical phrase, it seems like I can intelligibly ask, was that right? If I say something trite and trivial like, well, here is here, then I can't stop and ask, wait, is here here, or is it somewhere else? That sounds like, the kind of thing which the most hopelessly confused satire of philosophy involves you saying. I say that because there are kinds of cases in which you can ask things like, is here here, and you can ask things like, am I myself? But those are kind of irrelevant to the case I have in mind. The point is you get exactly the same kind of phenomena with spatial indexicals as you do with first-person indexicals. But people are somehow less scared of the spatial stuff, I think, because it's less private than the first-personal stuff. So if we can say that it's the same phenomenon in the two cases, maybe we don't need to be so scared of the first person. And it's got nothing to do with indexicals either. So let me give you another illustration of this kind of phenomenon. Suppose I have a favourite cup, and I baptize this cup Bob. Okay. So now I want to talk about Bob. I can do it by using the word Bob. I can say, Bob's a cup. I can say Bob is in need of a good wash. All sorts of reasonable things. I can ask questions, though, about whether I'm saying appropriate things at various times. So suppose I say, that cup is Bob. Then I can pause and say, wait, is that cup Bob? Or is a different cup Bob? Maybe sneaky people have come in and stolen my beloved Bob and replaced it with a very similar looking cup. Oh, I don't like those pesky people. I'm going to have to keep Bob well guarded. Strange, paranoid thing to think, but something that can be thought. It's not completely unintelligible. Of course, if I say, is Bob Bob, there's something very weird about that kind of a claim. It's very hard to stop and ask yourself, is Bob Bob? And so we get a similar thing. If you use a name, then there's a possibility of misidentification if you use anything other than that name. If your aim was to pick out the named thing and you use something other than the name, you could go wrong in principle. Is that always the case? You might think I said that Bob was my favourite cup, so I can't be mistaken about saying Bob is my favourite cup. Oh, but I put it to you I can. Because I can say Bob is my favourite cup, and then I can think, wait, is Bob still my favourite cup? I know Bob was my favourite cup, but plenty of cups have come and gone, and Bob's lost its lustre. I think Susie's my new favourite cup. There will always be a place in my heart for Bob, but Susie is now my favourite cup. And then maybe I can think, no, that's silly. I actually love Bob. I didn't mean to tease you, Bob. But the point is I can have these slightly odd thoughts. They make some kind of intelligible sense. The point is there's a possibility of error. There's a possibility that I will have failed to pick out Bob if I use anything other than the word Bob. And you know what? There's a possibility that I will have failed to pick out me if I use anything other than the word I or me. But that's no longer an interesting phenomenon. This is just the fact that you can always have these kinds of things. Let me give you a final example which sort of knits together the naming stuff with the first person stuff, partly because I've introduced it in my subtitle, but also because it actually, for those who know the literature, I'm deliberately and willfully making a kind of bunch of points right now against commonly held assumptions here. So it's sometimes suggested that the word I can't possibly function in anything like the role of a name for all of the reasons that I've been discussing, for all of that stuff about immunity to error through misidentification. The point I've just made is that names function exactly like first-person pronouns do in this regard. There's that possibility of error by misidentification. But now I want you to imagine someone who has rolled together the first person with their own name. There are many people you could choose because this is a phenomenon with a name. It's called Iliism. One of the first Iliists is Julius Caesar. And then notable Iliists since include Charles de Gaulle, Bob Dole, Nixon, and Donald Trump. Some people use Donald Trump's Iliism in an attempt to illustrate that he's a narcissist. And I think that's sort of a strange thing to do, because if you wanted to illustrate someone's narcissism, I don't understand why you'd fixate on a particular pattern of speech rather than on their bigly behaviour. But just sticking with the idea of rolling together a name with a first person, I don't want to talk about political cases. I want you to think about Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. For those who... that's a lovely... I hope that happens every time I say "The Rock," that there's a little ring. For those who don't know, The Rock only referred to himself as The Rock. He just did not use first-person locutions at all. When The Rock said, "Can you smell what The Rock is cooking?" it was not because he'd had a head injury and had forgotten that he was The Rock. When The Rock said, "The Rock will bring the smackdown," again, The Rock knew he was talking about himself. Now, how would The Rock formulate a thesis of immunity to error through misidentification? Would The Rock have been able to follow the discussion that we've had? Well, yes, because The Rock would say, there is a possibility of error in picking out The Rock whenever The Rock uses a phrase other than The Rock. So The Rock can ask himself intelligibly, is The Rock bringing the smackdown, or is it Triple X? No, it's The Rock. But The Rock can't ask himself, is The Rock The Rock? That's just as confused as when you and I ask ourselves, am I me? So here we have a case where a name has been loaded in the mouth of the person using it with quite clear first-personal content. There's nothing weird about... There's a lot that's weird, special, brilliant about The Rock, but there's nothing particularly philosophically terrifying, even if there's something physically terrifying about The Rock. I say all of this because this does go against the received wisdom of people talking in this literature, and I just don't think they watched enough wrestling when they were younger. Okay. Are we at an end there? Have we have we, in realizing that there's no particularly interesting issue of immunity to error through misidentification that attaches to first-person indexicals, are we in a situation where there's nothing mysterious left about the self? Well, no, because I've only been attacking one patch of mysteries. And there are many mysteries in life. So just to give you another little break, Lichtenberg, another wonderful Lichtenberg aphorism is, he marveled that cats had holes cut into their pelts exactly where their eyes were. Lichtenberg was a man of immense genius. There are many things that this aphorism gets at. One is that you can find wonder anywhere, and another is that this is a perfect one-line takedown of anyone who uses the argument from design as an argument for God's existence. They always come up with, importantly, like complicated things like, but how can the eye be like that? And you should say, no, isn't it a miracle that your eyelids go over your eyes and not somewhere where they'd be totally useless? Lichtenberg was kind of brilliant. But no, there are many different mysteries associated with the self. I've only been trying to target some of them in a limited talk, but I do want to come back to one of them. I want to come back to the idea about privacy, because we still have a lingering issue here, which is, as the rock uses the phrase the rock, it does mean something slightly different to him than as I use it. I don't think there's anything actually there particularly special about the rock. I think when I use the phrase Tim, it means something slightly different than when you guys use the phrase Tim, because you use it to pick me out, and I use it to pick me out, and I'm the one saying it. So there's a bit of a difference there. Just going back slightly to those cases where we're meant to say, when I say I hurt, it doesn't mean the same as saying Tim hurts, because if I had a life-altering brain injury, I might be confused as to who Tim is. Yeah, but I haven't had a life-altering brain injury, thank God, and I don't know how I could even set about doubting whether I am Tim. So actually, I think the way I use the word Tim is not that different from the way the rock systematically uses the rock. But what this suggests is that there is still some kind of importantly private stuff going on with our thoughts. It's not associated with immunity to error through misidentification anymore. It comes out just as much for sort of physical claims as for claims about supposedly private experience. So when I say, I've got a broken arm, and when you say, he's got a broken arm, it looks like we're doing slightly different things. And for the very simple reason, as Frege put it, this is on your handout, that everyone is presented to himself in a particular and primitive way in which he is presented to no one else. I think that's kind of right. The rock is presented to the rock as himself, which is to say the rock, or at least that's the only way he could articulate it. I am presented to myself not merely as Tim, I am presented to myself as me. There's a lovely line from William James, another hero of mine, where he says, if a crab were to find out that we had described it as a mere crustacean, he would say, no, I'm me. I feel like that. If you say, you know, it's just some 5'11" man called Tim. No, I am me. I'm presented to myself with rather more excitement than just that. So there is something here, something about a certain way of presenting yourself to you that other people don't get to have, and you have your own way of presenting yourself to you that I don't get to have, and all of that. So there is a certain kind of interesting privacy that still lingers. But I want to say it's not a scary, frightening kind of a privacy. And the best I can do to try to convince you that it's not a scary and frightening kind of a privacy is to tell a story, really. Because this would be frightening. This would be a scary kind of privacy if we thought that there was some hidden subject that was being picked out when I said, I hurt. From the first half of the talk, you might have thought that when I say I hurt, I'm trying to pick out this weird entity that none of the rest of you can pick out. I'm trying to pick out, like, my theatre of experience, which isn't an object in the world at all, and so only I am somehow able to talk about it, which I can't because it's not really there, and that all gets hopelessly tangled, and that's all very bad. But if all of the entities in question that are being picked out are very much public objects, then it's not going to be scary anymore. So, to try and make things unscary, I'm going to close with a little story. How long do I have? I'm just wondering how long to make the story.
5 minutes.
Ooh. Well, I was hoping for rather longer than that. Okay. No. That's good. That's conveyed something. It's fine. not hurt. Okay. So I want you to try to imagine a scenario in which there is no difference between spatial indexicals and first-person indexicals. And the reason I want to do this is because I don't think we're scared about spatial indexicals at all. I don't think we think that using the word here versus there has any deep philosophical puzzles associated with it. It's just a kind of coordinating reference mark. It's fine. But we get scared when we use first-person phrases. So if I can describe to you a community which doesn't distinguish between first-person and spatial stuff, maybe I'll manage to kind of soothe away some of these worries. So that's my aim, and here's how it goes. But I should warn you, this is kind of bonkers, and this may even be professional suicide doing this, because this is a kind of philosophy that basically went out of fashion a long while ago. But hey, I'm going for it. Okay, so I want you to imagine a community of trees. This is kind of inspired by Strawson. Okay, so the trees can see all around them. They can communicate with one another by speaking and listening, but they can't move at all. Okay, now there may be a few little minutiae we need to work out here, because you might think, well, how can they speak if they can't move at all? Can they not move their mouths? Telepathy, it's fine. I actually also don't really want you to be able to pick out parts of the trees. So if it helps you to imagine that the trees are point particles, that will be good too. But it will be annoying if we get into those kind of details. Basically, I just want you to imagine a community which is rooted, all of its members are rooted to the spot. Okay. I now need to describe to you enough about this community to make it seem like they could have an intelligible form of life at all. So I want you to imagine that there is a disease which affects the trees. It's a kind of blight. This blight causes the trees tremendous pain, and they manifest this by moaning unintelligibly. If a tree contracts blight, the very first symptom is that it changes colour. And this is, of course, something which is publicly observable. And then the pain typically starts the next day. Fortunately, there's a way for the trees to guard against the pain. They can go into hibernation as soon as the colour change happens. And if they go into hibernation, then they can kind of ride out the pain in a sleep state and then kind of come back when it's all over, which is good. But they don't want to go into hibernation unnecessarily because they feel very lethargic after they do it. And also it impedes them in going about their important tree-ish business, like communicating with one another and thinking abstract thoughts that trees do. So other things being equal, the setup is trees want to hibernate just in case they've changed colour, because the colour change is the thing which indicates that they're going to suffer this painful disease. With me so far? Okay. Unfortunately, the trees have no means to see themselves directly. They can't tell directly whether they've changed colour. They can't sort of look down at themselves. They have to find out in a public way that they've changed colour. And there are two ways that they can do this. The first is they can have the testimony of another tree, because the trees can see all around them, so the trees can see all of the other trees, just not themselves. And so one tree can say to another, oh, you've changed colour, you should go into hibernation. That's one way. The other way in which they can see that they've changed colour is that there's a really big mirror above them. I should probably have mentioned that earlier. The sky is an enormous mirror, so they can look at that and they can see their reflection. But neither of these ways of telling that they've changed colour is perfect. For a start, the testimony of other trees is not always reliable. Some trees have enemies. Trees sometimes lie to one another. One of them might maliciously say, you've changed colour, to make it hibernate, when in fact it hasn't changed colour. Another might say, oh no, you're perfectly fine, because it wants it to suffer the pain. Equally, the mirror's not 100% reliable because there are clouds that pass above and they sometimes distort it. So you might mistake as a tree your reflection for someone else's reflection and so get confused as to whether it was exactly you that's changed colour. Okay, so there we go. That's me finishing describing the community of trees. That probably took itself 5 minutes, but I do need to say a little bit about why I've done this. Stopping there would be very weird. It's not like stopping in 5 minutes is going to be any less weird. Okay. My big claim about the trees is that they will have a form of life which is almost intelligible to us. This story, hopefully, you could see how if I were in any sense good at writing fiction, I could develop this into some kind of a tale, maybe. You could follow it, you could understand the trees' various motivations and stuff like that. But my big claim about the trees is this. They can't conceive of any difference between first-personal indexicals and spatial indexicals. So to show this, I just kind of want to run through what their language would be like and suggest that interpreting it such that it's systematically ambiguous in this way is going to be perfectly acceptable. So I also think that they have all the same kinds of interesting phenomena about first-person or spatial thought as we do, despite the fact that they can't tell these things apart. Okay, so here's a mundane first point. Suppose a tree says, I hear, hurt. I've said I hear really close to each other because I want you to not be sure whether they're saying I hurt or hear hurts, right? Because we can't necessarily tell yet whether they're using a first person or a spatial phrase. So they say, I hear, hurt. Another tree can, of course, sympathize and say, oh, poor you there. Again, it's ambiguous whether they're talking about a person or a location. Everything seems to go just fine in terms of public communication. The I hear serves the role of drawing other trees' attention to a particular place or tree, depending on how you think about it, and noting that something sympathy-worthy is occurring with them or there, depending on how you think about it. Now, the trees can't offer each other medicinal quantities of brandy because they can't move, so they also can't drink, which is unfortunate for them, but they can offer expressions of condolence and stuff like that. So there can be a role for these public utterances to play. So the very first stage is that the way in which they say, I hear, hurt, seems comparable to the way in which I say, I hurt. It has a certain kind of a role publicly. Okay, so the really interesting phenomena, though, were meant to concern privacy and the immunity to error through misidentification. So now I just want to show that we get the same kind of things about these words in the tree language which are ambiguous between spatial and first personal as we do in our own natural English. So imagine one of the trees looks up at the great mirror above them and notices that they've changed colour. Well, they might pause and think, hang on, is it certainly me/here which has changed colour? Or might it be him/there? Perfectly intelligible question to ask. Much like the case of, am I sure it's me that has a broken arm and not someone else? And the fact that the great mirror is not infallible because of the clouds passing by means that it's sometimes a sensible question for them to ask. Maybe they should ask for the testimony of a friendly tree who they trust to say, have I changed colour? I think I have. Or, has here changed colour? Here thinks here has. Kind of unclear exactly what they're saying. Okay, so that's the kind of analogue of the broken arm case. What about the analogue of the hurting case? Well, that's exactly the same. If a tree thinks to itself, I hear hurt, then it looks like they're going to have a certain kind of unintelligibility if they try to ask themselves, is it definitely I hear that hurts and not someone somewhere else? That would be a weird kind of a thing for a tree to ask itself. But the only way in which it's a weird kind of a thing to ask itself is the same way in which it's kind of weird for the tree to ask itself, when I say I hear have changed colour, is it definitely I hear that I'm thinking about and not someone somewhere else? We have all of these same phenomena occurring here. We have all of the kind of richness of supposed immunity to error through misidentification and then realizing that that's just a phenomenon that happens with indexicals generally, and indeed with names and all of the other stuff. But we have a systematic ambiguity about whether they're speaking first personally or spatially. The fact that their lives are so rooted means that I don't think that they could even learn the supposed difference between first personal and spatial locutions. I'm not even sure it will make sense to talk about interpreting them one way rather than another. But the central point, the reason I've talked about the trees, is that there's nothing mysterious with the thoughts that they're having in this case. There's no great privacy here. A tree has to represent itself, or that location, to itself, or to that location, using a certain kind of indexical, which it can't use to speak about another tree or location, depending on how you think about it. But there's no mystery as to how the trees learn language. There's no mystery as to how they communicate with one another. There's no sense that these thoughts are irrevocably private. All they are is perspectival. They're just, by virtue of the fact that they are said somewhere, / by someone, representing things in a particular way. But there's no deep privacy there. There's no deep unintelligibility. There's something which is wholly public, wholly manifestable, wholly learnable. And that, if I leave you with anything, is what I want you to take away from what I've tried to say about the first person. I started off telling you things are really confusing, things are weird, it looks like there's this use of the phrase which is deeply private, it looks like there's this mysterious self which is no part of the world, private object which vanishes away to the world's very limits. And then I tried to bring things back in and say there should be no mystery, there's no notion of privacy, it's all perfectly public, it's all fine, there's nothing particularly perplexing here at all. And I got to say something about Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and trees as well, so success. Thank you.